Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this spotlight session of Professor Ahmet Atay, whose PhD is from the Southern Illinois University in 2009, who is a professor in the Department of Global Media and Digital Studies, and also the Department of Communication at the College of Wooster in Ohio, and also presently an instructor in the Department of Intercultural Communication in Raikyo University in Japan. And Dr. Atay Ahmet is also the first VP for the Central States Communication Association right now. So big year, and I am so super excited to have this session. Excuse me. I arrived in the United States with 2 suitcases full of clothes and stories. While my clothes represented the European street fashion of the time, naturally, my stories embody the aspects of my in-between, global movements and hope. Growing up in Cyprus, the divided Mediterranean island between the Turks and the Greeks in a former British colony, but now a European Union country, I learned to constantly negotiate my cultural identity in relation to local, national, and international politics. I was living as a hybrid subject, belonging to multiple places, histories, and stories, yet simultaneously belonging nowhere. These are Ahmet's words that kicked off his wonderful chapter in the 2nd edition of the Handbook of Autoethnography. Personally, I think one of the best things I've read from Ahmet. That chapter is called Translation and Tango, Decolonizing Autoethnography. So I wanted to begin with those words, and that chapter will frame a bunch of the different questions that I have. I suspect our plan will go out the window as we just let go into a more free-flowing conversation. I should say that there is a personal connection between Ahmet and me. We're not ex-husbands. We are friends, grad student friends. I'm so grateful that person got off the plane and has stayed largely. We overlapped in grad school. I was finishing my PhD. Ahmet's first year, and this Twinkie gay boy shows up in good fashion, and we take him to lunch, and we must have done something good because he came and became such a dear part of that community in our lives and my life. So I wanted to disclose that we've got a history. We always do. Nevertheless, so hello, Ahmet. By the way, will you tell us where you're at right now?
Hello, I am in Brighton, UK.
Yeah.
I am not in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, for a change.
And what are you doing there?
I'm at University of Brighton, and as well as I'm affiliated with University of Bristol. I am in 2 different research centers. One of them is on narrative, memory, and histories, and the other one I'm doing work on transnational gender and sexuality.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we will hear more about those interests as we go forward. As everyone's been saying, there won't be enough time, but I hope that we really get a good conversation going. So my purpose, the purpose that I've seen in doing this is to shine a light on your work, Ahmet, and to affirm that work and to talk about the extensive work that you've done ever since earning your PhD to date. I'm especially mindful of the importance of doing that in general, but in particular in light of transnational bodies of color, queer bodies of color. And so that's what makes it especially important in my heart and mind today to do that. And you do such great work for that. I've 2 kind of positions. You're welcome. 2 kind of positions are, I just said that. The first one was that. I want to celebrate Ahmet and all the work you've done. But I also believe that all of that work you've done is instructive and can help people attending the conference, as you do on a regular basis, to kind of understand scholarship how you see it, to understand stories and autoethnography as you see them, so that folks who have similar lived experience could maybe, to coin a phrase from Stacey Holman Jones, hook their story onto yours, right? Because we know how important models are. And mentors, formally and informally. I don't think it exists without them, So let's just talk real briefly here about numbers. right? Let's talk about numbers. I don't know how you're standing, or you're sitting, but I don't know how you stand generally. Ahmet's CV is expansive. He has published 20 books. 3 additional books are under contract in progress, right? We're going to talk about probably some of those edited collections. Ahmet's solo authored book is Globalization's Impact on Cultural Identity Formation, Queer Diasporic Males in Cyberspace, through Lexington, published in 2015. And we're going to come back to cyberspace and cyber ethnography. Oh, there's more. 27 solo and co-authored journal articles, you maybe count. 5 special editorships of special journal issues, 46 book chapters. 46 book chapters, numerous awards honoring Ahmet's writing, and hundreds of presentations for conference participation. So again, I don't know how you stand. So with that said, let me get to the real stuff here. So I thought it might be helpful to kind of talk about, origin stories are so important, and that's a concept and a practice that has been mentioned quite a bit here in the past couple of days. What is your origin story in terms of how you came to autoethnography and personal narrative?
That's an excellent question, and I know exact date and actually the situation. I was at University of Northern Iowa in Leah White's qualitative research methods class, and we were doing ethnography interviews, and we come to performance, and we end up with Tammy Spry's work, and then we read Carolyn and Art's work on the Denson handbook chapter. So Leah White was trained by Frederick Corey at Arizona State University with performance and narrative-based research. So one of the things that she says to us in the class, most of the qualitative classes that you are probably going to encounter, and this is 2002, spring 2002, that they would not touch autoethnography at all. They would not do performance methodologies at all. So this is very probably out of the ordinary for master students to be exposed 21 years ago, right? So, so that's how I encountered it first. And I fall in love with it. I fall in love with it when I progress into another class on interpersonal communication. I wanted to work with autoethnography, and April Chapman Carpenter, who writes about autoethnography at the moment, really said, I am new to it too. Let's give it a try. Let's see where you go with it. So that's the origins of the journey. And then when I was looking for PhD programs, all of a sudden SIU became in my radar, because I also read some of Rampilius's work at that point. So while through all of this, I end up at SIU taking my autoethnography class 2024 spring, 19 years ago, with Tony Adams sitting next to me. And since then, I have been deeply involved with the method itself.
Yeah, so Tony was doing his master's at the time and then went on to do the PhD at USF. We also had Jay Brower of Western Connecticut State University. We had W. Benjamin Myers, who's participating in the conference. And of course, Sandra Lynn Pensino, who's also participating in that and who is back at SIU. So this interesting little cohort, right, of autoethnography scholars and friends formed and took off. So you told us about how you encountered autoethnography in those 2 kind of phases. I wonder what fears did you have thinking about doing the method, just general fears, and why did you stay?
Oh God, my first fear was English is my second language, even though I grew up in the British Island. My first language was Turkish, and I started taking English class at the age of 5 or 6, and then forced to take a third language, which I ended up with German. But the idea of writing stories in another language was so foreign, right? So scary. Those of you who are writing probably in your first language, it's scary enough to write stories, but trying to do that in a second language was very, very scary. Very scary that I was questioning if I was going to write evocative enough, if I was going to write poetic enough, if I was going to craft the stories for the American audience, even though my storytelling is very not American at all. So I had so many fears going into it.
Mhm. Okay, we're going to get to that storytelling style in just a couple of minutes. And that makes great sense. I was just such massive, I have the honor to be able to work with PhD students and such a massive appreciation for the labor. You know, I used to be near fluent in Spanish, and even then, I don't know how I could do that. Right clear and all the politics of that, right? But
yeah, and I was also thinking, like, now I have actually, after being in the US for 25 years, I have never written anything scholarly in Turkish. I have no sense of writing in Turkish in any
wow.
scholarly language. So I don't even see myself as an autoethnographer in another language. So that's the dilemma of, I guess, which we can talk more about it.
And the hybridity that you talk about a lot in
Yeah.
your work. Holy cow, I hadn't thought of that. I'm an autoethnographer in the English language.
Exactly, that's it, which was my fear to begin with.
And then why'd you stay? What was it about the method for you?
Good question. I think I often think about this, as those of you who read Bell Hooks, she talks about coming to theory to understand herself. And I think I came to the method to understand myself as somebody who was not living in divided island Cyprus. I was living miles and miles away from home, trying to understand where I fit in the larger schema of the US culture as somebody who was accented in and intersectional in so many ways. So the method became a vehicle to talk about globalization, to talk about queer theory, to talk about post-colonial dislocations and relocations. So therefore, the method itself made me to stay with it and allow me to do the work that I am enjoying to do at the moment.
I love that. We share a love for that quotation from Bell Hooks, which for me and probably you came from Lenore Langsdorff.
Yeah.
A major professor for me and a professor for 5 or 6 of your classes, right?
Yeah.
Like Bell writes, but I came to theory to heal.
Yeah.
And healing is a construct and practice that's been, mentioned a bunch of times so far at the conference. And so it always takes me back there. Do you remember, by the way, your first bigger autoethnography or writing that was autoethnographic at SIU? What'd you write on first?
It was in Ron Pilius's class, and I was struggling with my own identity about figuring out the queer piece. So my first experiments was about that. Was it a good autoethnography? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But as somebody who was trying to figure the I guess the writing style and try to understand how this works, I think it was a brave move in my part to put myself out there and try to hash out my own identity markers.
That sure was, I often say, a community to find yourself, right? A place where you become good people, I thought.
Yeah, and Ron provided that space to, I guess, to explore who we are in the class and really, applaud for that.
Absolutely. So I'm going to come back to stories and your stories. I'm also hooked on to this idea of transnational queer hope. National queer hope, page 295. But let's talk about, I mentioned the numbers for that work, but I wonder if you'd want to talk a bit about some more, like one or two of your more recent edited collections. So to my eyes, you have your work with Ashlock. The book is Social Media, Technology, and New Generations. Maybe we hit on that one first. Like, can you tell us, kind of speak a little bit to what the focus is and what you and your collaborator hope to do with those topics?
Sure. So to pause and give you a little bit of a sense, I am
take your time.
Media studies scholar, film scholar, visual culture scholar, intercultural cultural studies, and globalization scholar. So therefore, it just uses all sorts of different methods, techniques, and many different ideas that are not really maybe in the mainstream. So, several years ago, Mary and I we met at University of Louisville when I was there for a year, and we started to think about millennials at the time, our students, the people that we are educating. Who are they? What they like, what they don't like, and this idea of the culture that surrounds us, about so much mediacy, so much mediation, and the visual push into it. So we experimented with the millennials in the classroom. We've done work with the millennials in organizations. And then we have done 2 books now on millennials, and then the Gen Z, because the years have passed and we have a new generation. Their interest about the visual culture, visual stories, right? So again, it's the narrative arc in my research that it's not oral stories or written stories, but the visual stories. Why are they so fascinated with the visual storytellers? So we've done a lot of work on that. I experimented with autoethnography and writing about the self in the social media, which we can talk more about that later in cyberethnography. But I have been really questioning about what happens to the self or different selves when we are on social media. So the project is really about teasing out the millennial and Gen Z experience, which they are completely immersed in the mediated reality. What happens to them, their identities, their communication, their culture. So we have been really dwelling on that idea.
Wonderful, wonderful. And how about pedagogies of post-truth with Call?
Sure. That is Dave Kale from Penn State, Bern. We have been really talking a lot about teaching under at the time under the Trump administration. And as somebody who became a US citizen under the Trump administration, I became very cautious about, before and after, what kind of things I can say in the classroom and what kind of things I cannot say in the classroom. What kind of troubles am I going to get into if I say certain things and whatnot? So it became this idea of what happens when there is this alternative universe that the people are creating about what is being truth and what is not the truth, and how do we communicate that to the students who come from very different political backgrounds, right? I have students who are extremely far-leaning, left-leaning, and I have students who were the Trump supporters at the time. How do we talk about the things such as race, immigration, trans bodies, and things like that when they are so much being targeted by the main political structure? So that came about as an experiment to figure out how can we talk about the issues that we have inherited with the Trump and the Brexit realities about this alternative media or cultural outlets where people are questioning people's stories and what is being truth and what is not being the truth.
Thank you. Yeah, it really puts up for question what stories are. It could be very easy to take stories, well, not at this conference and not for autoethnographers typically, but it's just a story. He's just a storyteller, right?
Yeah.
But when we think about your work and work similar to it, there's a different texture to it. I'm going to get to that in a quick second. But I wondered if you want to talk about 1 or 2 of the chapters in Post-Truth, like what stands out to you? What's a sample folks might expect?
One of the very early chapters is about a scholar who teaches in Indiana. Those of you who don't know the politics of Indiana, it's a very red state. It's a very conservative state, and a person teaches there. It's a liberal. It's a private university, liberal leaning. But she talks about how much trouble she get into, talking about some of the things in the classroom that she argued against Trump, and how the students really took that into the administration, and they have really challenged her within and outside of the classroom. Some of the pieces are looking at the media, including mine. How do we teach media studies when the whole idea of media or its integrity being questioned by a lot of people who are leaning in the far right at the moment, because they're critiquing the media being very liberal, at least in the context of the US or the mainstream media. And we are also, there are also pieces that dwells on what happens to bodies who are teaching these classes in the classroom, when there is also, a reaction from, or some kind of pressure or the gatekeeping from the department chairs or the administration, and some reaction from the students. So it is really a hybrid between the stories that happen in the classroom, but also how to teach some of these things in 2022 or 2023, when there's so much attack to the media as an institution, but also the questioning the integrity of it.
I love it. I love it. First off, that it's a response in part with the post-truth to that clown's campaign for disinformation, put it very lightly, but it also taps into post-marriage, right? This illusion that post-marriage equality, that things are just golden, and post-race, of course, with being elected twice, right?
Yeah, post-feminism and all of that. So we know that all of those are, false narratives that they,
I love that, and I love it's a reminder that there's good and bad autoethnography, right? And there are criteria for good autoethnographies, and that what I'm thinking most specifically here is that it's not just diary, it's not just reflection, it's the telling and exploring of personal stories. At the Carolyn Ellis talks in Ethnographic Eye about the higher social value, right? Dwight Conquergood talked about it being at the sake of something bigger.
And
our own stories aren't enough. How we use them, right?
Yeah, and it's not only the culture, but also the politics that shapes the culture that we experiment.
You bet. Thank you for that segue. So yours are a particular sort of storytelling that I identify with, but not the same ways, right? It's and I think our bodies and beings guide us a little bit differently with that. And I'd have to at least in part acknowledge the advantage as a white male, cisgendered male. But on page 295 of your handbook chapter, you write, I saw your smile on your face. The stories I tell are accented, hybrid, and circular. And I tell them in the shadows of colonization, globalization, and isolation. Yeah, just a storyteller, right? Well, there's a point. My stories are queer, crooked, accented, and translated, told to make sense of my past, present, and future. I tell hybrid stories about in-betweenness, power, politics, and cultural identity to colonize. There's a lot there, right? It's packed. Do you mind talking through a little bit of that? Things that maybe, folks who are new to this, and new to all those practices and stuff. Just what do you want to say about all that? Your approach to stories and what they are for you and someone like you.
Sure. So I actually, I'm doing a project which we can talk more about that later. It's about the past. It's about something that I never really wanted to do for the longest time, but now I am doing it. It's about the stories of the past. Again, I come from a country that's seen a lot of colonization, that has been colonized by the Greeks, the Ottomans, the Brits, the Venetians, the French, and you name it. And therefore, they left something behind, the stories of the past. And one of the things that intrigued me about how much of the past is in the present and how much of that present it's about in the shape of the storytelling about the past. So I found myself not long ago, 2 weeks ago, looking back into the storytelling of how I came to storytelling and what is the storytelling style of home. Those of you who live in or been to a Mediterranean region, you know that people tell a lot of stories with animation. The hands move, the body moves, and it's a lot of loudness goes on. And back home, we tell the stories as a collective that people cut each other and add to the story, and we take a lot of detours that nothing is linear. So therefore, the stories that I tell, or the stories that I am used to, are part of these idea of constant interruption, the constant interruption of the colonial past, but also people's interruption of the story. But also, how do we tell a story that has accent to it, right? As I started early, English is my second language, even though I grew up in a British past colonial island. The British language and the British culture is infused to everything that we did as a kid. So it comes with that past that I needed to unpack. So I started to put together maybe a new perspective of how do we tell stories that is so much infused with the colonial past, but also is accented that I needed the second language to tell the stories, and what happens to the stories and my telling of them when I translate from experience that happened in a different language to a second language, and what is being left behind or fall behind, between the cracks and never been articulated.
I love that. And I should have said in the beginning, by the way, we'll come to, if we have time, to some questions from folks, and we should. Yeah, it's, I know the answer to this, but why is that work important? And to call out a late friend of ours, John Warren, how he would put it, what's at stake if we don't take stories seriously in that way? Why do you do it?
I think the erasure, right? So, and this is a critique, Devika and I came to the decolonial autoethnography, which we can talk more about that later, as a critique to say that our voices are not, or our stories are not in the mix yet. And when you don't get to tell your story, that there is an erasure of not only your story, but the story of your people and the story of the history. So those of us who are implants in the US, we come with very different stories. And if we don't tell the story, or at least have we experienced it, then there is an erasure of that. So that if the story is not there, that means who I am is not really fully in there, in people's eyes.
That's great. So racism, ethnocentrism, make that necessary.
Very much so, very much so.
And you write a lot in recent years, I think it's just recent, if I'm not mistaken, especially with the handbook chapter on the notion of translating.
Yeah.
Right. So not only does your work demonstrate the importance of voice and critically oriented stories, accented, hybrid, circular, bringing your stories out of the shadows of colonization. But not only is that erasure there as injustice, but it was reminded by reviewing your chapter, the requirement to translate and what that meant, right? And so I'm actually going to read a couple passages of yours because it really implicated me in particular ways. So, and again, if you're just coming in, this is from the Handbook of Autoethnography, Ahmet's chapter in the second edition. So on translating, some of this makes me so angry. And by the way, that chapter is really phenomenological too, looking at the nuances and, very circumspect. No certainty in a way, right? But it's contingent. Anyway, it's great. So translating, I am not a translator. You say on 299. That is not my profession. I could hear you saying that. I do, however, translate to live, but I never get paid for my work. I translate in order to exist, to carry on, to communicate, and to tell stories. Like so many transnational and queer scholars, I've learned to translate. You go on. Throughout my academic career, I've often translated to make sense of your experiences and stories, speaking to a reader, or actually speaking to folks unlike you, right? And now I am asking you to meet me. I love that. And learn to translate in order to see me and the marginality in my story. You mentioned Ron Pelias. I could just hear him saying that phrase is yummy. He has a yummy paragraph, but you go on. I want to also note that in this process, our cultural identity and the complexities of our culturally infused stories are negotiated, edited, altered, policed, and as you say, often erased, only to be molded into the mainstream narrative, right? I am often punished when I use circular stories and organizational structures in my writing. I ease the pain for you. Great line, pissed me off. I edit my sentence. I change my word choices. I change my examples so they are not too foreign to you. So you can feel the way I feel within your comfort zone. We feel uncomfortable for you. That's a lot there, right? But it's just so powerful, right? It's so powerful. What do you want to say about that? We're kind of putting your words out there hanging, right? And by the way, I'm going to put, for folks who need some visual, I'm going to put these passages in the chat right after the session. So what do you want to say about all that, friend?
Sure, I think this is the critique of the US American academia, that the compulsory English is in our DNA. As I said, I don't know how to write academically in another language because it is so ingrained in me. It is ingrained, but it is policed left to right. It's been punished left to right to mold into the mainstream. And if you are not in the mainstream, you are in the margins. Therefore, those of you who live in the margins of the academia, people have a tendency of not seeing you, not hearing your voice, not reading your work. So therefore, what I was actually critiquing, this force that forces us to do this translation work, not only from the language, but also the cultural translation. Those of you who are transnational queer bodies, also the queer translation that goes into it. It's a lot of work. Those of you who are working in multiple languages, that it's a lot of work. And I was also thinking that yesterday, and I posted as a Facebook message, those of you who speak a second language, it's hard to be funny in a second language. It takes a lot of effort to be crafty, funny person. And it takes even more, effort to be very complicated, smart writer that really combines theory with the method and the lived experience, and really puts out there an autoethnography that is complex and complicated, right? So writing stories in different languages is hard, and doing it well is even harder. So therefore, I wanted to let the audience or the reader know that those of us who are writing on the margins with an accent, this is a lot of effort. So when you read it, take time to understand that this is actually a lot of work.
Yeah, and that readers need to do some of that lifting.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And part of that makes greater sense now, that idea that that you have to tell patched together stories, which you write about a couple times in the chapter here on page 300. So it's always a patching together, right? Never something that is inherently whole.
No, and it's never complete.
Yeah. We could argue all day and talk through how lived experience is like that generally, right?
Yeah.
But that would be doing a disservice to the oppression and the hardship that you're articulating in your work, And so so in other words, that process is disproportionate.
Yeah,
it's disproportionate.
And oftentimes I know some people in the session before this one mentioned that getting those voices or stories or autoethnographies published, it's in itself, it's a hard work, right? So there is also that dimension that so much gatekeeping that happens that they often not meet the eye.
Mm-hmm. That's why these conversations are essential, right? It's been said multiple times, but Nelson just said in one of the last two sessions, really hoping that we get to that conversation of, bodies of color,
Yeah.
in this academic space. And so it makes me happy that we're doing what we're doing here in part, which is incomplete as well, but it's something, right? It's something. So how about, do you want to talk for a minute or two on cyber autoethnography? Kind of just some highlights of how you envision it, how you do it, and what it helps with?
Sure. And this comes from pre-COVID, and then the COVID just makes me to want me to write the whole book on cyber autoethnography, because it's here. It just has to be on the paper. I realized at one point that I have not seen my family or friends who live abroad, and only way that I was able to communicate with them and maybe drop into their stories and drop out was through mediation, right? So these Zooms and the Skypes and the WhatsApp calls or the meets or whatever we were doing, everything was cyber. So the cyber was the only way I was able to make sense of their reality and them my own reality. So I realized that I started to live a mediated digital life that is so much infused to what I do any given day. So, and then of course I was experimenting with this social media as being the window to present aspects of ourselves to the strangers or the familiar, and how much of what we put into those platforms is a story, visual, written, or in some refiguration of those, or sometimes the sound bites. So I start to experiment with, if we take all of those seriously as part of who we are, as part of our ongoing story, we got to start thinking about autoethnographies that are or the experiences that are, or narratives that are happening in the mediated realm, in the cyber world, and how do we capture those? So, and then the COVID happens and I don't leave my house for 18 months. So then I started to live completely online. And what does that do to somebody who is living in, by himself in the middle of nowhere, right? You really start living a digital life. Your stories become digital because that's the only thing that is holding you together. You teach digitally, you watch things digitally, you talk to people digitally. So I wanted to capture this idea of digital experience that is culturally infused, that is decolonizing, that is queer, that is very different than the traditional ways of experiencing the world.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned Wooster at least twice. It took me to, as you know, I lived in Duluth, Minnesota for 10 years. And you mentioned bell hooks about healing. Do you write this? This is heavy. Do you write to survive in the middle of nowhere?
Absolutely. The one of my first autoethnographies that is published, The Journey of Errors, it's about survival. And I think the writing that really helped me to survive. I was angry. There was a lot of anger in me about the spaces that I was occupying and surrounded by. So it's not only healing, but it's also a survival for me to do this work. And, during the COVID, I literally lived within the 1 mile radius. So I often think about a life within a 1 mile. So that's an essay that I promised myself I'm going to write sooner or later. But it's about survival. And, the stories are about survival for me.
Good. I wish we had more time because I'd keep going there. But let's keep going in this path at least. How about, since we're on cyber autoethnography, do you want to give a few words about decolonizing autoethnography, which of course drives the handbook chapter? Like what is, this is, again, all these things could take a week, right? But what does that particular approach to autoethnography aim to do? And I'm thinking here your work with Devika Chawla, the special issue.
Devika and I approach this in two different ways. One is we can use autoethnographies to decolonize whatever we're doing. And the second way is to decolonize the autoethnography itself by writing stories or narratives or autoethnographic work that is accented, that is patched together, that is not linear, that is not US-centric, but still depends on the English as the main vehicle to do this work, which we can talk about bilingual or multilingual autoethnographies as part of this project, but pushes this idea of really decentering the US ways of writing and knowing, and allows us to think outside of the box about other experiences, other stories that are being written by the bodies that are not the mainstream.
Okay, thank you. And you did a workshop on that 2 years ago.
I have, yes,
At
yes.
ISAN. That's right. I tell you, I'm running late to this idea, but it just occurred to me the metaphor of patched up. In my mind, something that's patched up is something that needs fixing. Something harmed. And that just, I don't know, it just, maybe others got that immediately from hearing it, but it's, as we talk and as you tell your story, it just really becomes clearer to me. So cyber decolonizing. We have way too many questions, don't we? Is there, I'm thinking of a more pragmatic kind of skills thing. For if you're speaking to new autoethnographic writers, right? First, what is one way that you recommend to get started? What could they do right now, tomorrow, if they want to, or tonight, opening up Word? Like where does one start? Because this takes some practice, right, and skill, and it takes time, right? But we have a lot of folks who come to the conference, thankfully, who are new. So how about for them?
Sure. I think for me, it's what's the issue, what's the dilemma, what's the story I want to tackle, and I am going to tackle the issue with the story, and the story with the issue together. As we have been talking about last 2 or 3 days, there are bad autoethnographies. So one of the things that I want to be careful, saying this, fuse the personal with cultural, with the political, and with the theory to make it nuanced, rich storytelling that borrows and knits together different aspects of it. Otherwise, the stories might just be too flat. It's not nuanced. It's a lot of, it's a lot of telling, but no showing. So show the anger, show the pain, show the fear, show whatever you're feeling, but always think about the poetic, the creative, with the theoretical, with the lived experience, with the cultural milieu that surrounds it. Always those things needs to be in the question. Up, you're muted, Keith.
Well, you missed me saying I love it. And ultimately also to that, just write. Get busy going, right? And think of one situation related to a problem, to get going, and then to make it this rich text. And I think it's too, remembering we're going to be honoring Laurel Richardson in a next spotlight session, but her work in the 90s of writing as a method of inquiry. You don't have to have it figured out when you're writing it. The actual writing of it will often help you figure it out.
Yeah, and trust the story. I think the story is going to guide you. So one thing that I learned is just trust the story. It will show you the way.
I love it. And you can write for yourself too, right? You don't have to share it. Yeah. Is there anything that you want to share that we haven't talked about? What are you working on right now? What's getting your attention? And is there anything else you want to share on?
I am so much torn between multiple things. I am definitely working on a book on nothing to do with autoethnography and soap operas. But when I'm not working on that, I am really formulating ideas about decolonizing autoethnography and really writing accented and crooked stories.
Good, thank you. Sorry, I just saw a prompt here. We have a question. Let's look at Vieira's, if you could see it. Could you share some resources or AE scholarship that you personally find most inspiring? Great question. What do you think are good resources to go to?
Absolutely. Early on in my career, when I start doing this, I read all of Carolyn Nard's work, and then of course Rampelius, Tammy Spray, Brian Alexander, and people like that. And then I started to always go to Devika Chawla for inspiration because of the type of lived experiences that we have and type of things that we are thinking about. And there are others who are writing Kakali Bhattacharya's ideas about home or homelessness in academia, and sources like that is always inspiring me because I see part of me in their stories. So I'm just keep going back for more. And, a lot of queer stuff that Tony and Keith is writing and others have been contributing. Those are always there when I needed a fusion of the transnational with the queer and, some of that. So, Vera, I'm more than happy to send you a source list.
Mm-hmm. And you'll see when you check out the message, she also speaks to identifying with your experiences. So that's great. Anybody have a question you'd like to throw out there? We have a couple minutes left. I don't know if I want to agree with you saying you're not humorous, Ahmet, by the way, but I know you meant it in writing. But just to hear Ahmet tell his story of how people mispronounce his first name is to know that this man has a sense of humor that's incredible. But that's, I know how you meant it though. Okay, I don't see any hands, right? With more time, we'd want to talk about your love for soap operas.
Absolutely.
And you have some connection to Days of Our Lives, is it?
And The Young and Restless, they are
And even on the
stories
set,
keeping me alive.
She is a complex being. I don't know what you're saying
Yes,
here.
Tony, absolutely. Agatha Christie.
Yes.
Actually, I propose a paper about Christie. We can talk more about that later.
Oh, I thought you were giving one of the fake names people think that they call them. And by the way, it's if you were to listen to that story, it's Amlish, Amish.
Omelette.
He's been called Omelet. So each conference we get a new treat of a couple new nicknames. But I don't see any more questions. So let me end with you from page 301. Ahmet writes, It was not easy to write this chapter. I paused a lot. I lost my thoughts, failed to translate, and finally chose not to give you a linear story with a clear beginning and an end. I do not want this chapter to end because I believe that you and I have just started to understand one another. Our tango has just started. So in addition to being so happy that you got off and stayed off that plane and more or less and didn't go back safe for vacation, I just know that we are so lucky to have you in our community.
Thank you.
We're lucky to be part of that dance. And as far as I go, you are never in that tango alone.